This lesson is about the 8 characteristics of life. These characteristics can be remembered by using the mnemonic Mr. Schreng.
How do we know if something is alive? When I pose this question to students, they may respond by saying because they breathe or that they are thinking. But if you look at their answers, bacteria don't breathe and a sunflower doesn't think. So how can we generally tell whether something is alive? Biologists have developed a list of 8 characteristics shared by all living organisms. It is often useful to develop a mnemonic to remember lists, and you may have heard of Mrs. Gren before, but this only covers 7 out of the 8 characteristics. So I use Mr. Schreng to remember all 8. M for movement, R for respiration, S for sensitivity, H for homeostasis, R for reproduction, E for excretion, N for nutrition, and G for growth. Before I go into the definitions of each of these characteristics, I want to do an introductory activity with you.
We will start by trying to group items into 3 different categories: living, once living, and non-living. I suggest you draw a table with 3 columns, one titled living, one titled once living, and one titled non-living. I'm going to take you on a walk, and I would like you to look at the various items we come across and decide which column they fit into. The once living column should include things that used to live or be part of a living organism but are no longer. For example, a banana in the fruit bowl. That banana used to be on a growing banana tree and was part of that tree. It is not regarded as living as it has no viable seeds in it. In other words, the seeds are sterile and cannot grow into plants due to the way we have bred them.
Here we are outside my back door. Here's a rose bush in a ceramic pot. Would we put the rose bush into living, once living or non-living, and the ceramic pot into living, once living or non-living? Well, hopefully you would put the rose bush into living and the ceramic pot into non-living. Let's carry on with the walk. This metal signpost. Think about which group this should belong to. Should it be living, once living or non-living? Write it down into the column that you think it belongs to. We finally got into the fields, which are nice and quiet, away from all those cars. I'm in a field now full of grass. What group would you put the grass into? Living, once living or non-living? This brick. Which group will you put the brick into? Write it down in your table. Feather. What group would you put that into? Living, once living or non-living? And the bees next to me, if I can catch them. Can you see the bees? What group would you put those into? Sadly, there's always some rubbish on the walk. What group would you put this rubbish into? Don't worry, I'm going to pick it up and take it home with me. Sadly, some more rubbish. This is paper. What does paper belong to? Living, once living or non-living? Here's a bunch of flowers somebody's left behind. What group do these belong to? Write it down in your table. What about these thistle flowers on the plant? Are they living, once living or non-living? Here's a wooden fence. What group would you put the wooden fence into? Here's a signpost for my walk that I'm going on the National Forest Way. It's made of plastic. So is that living, once living or non-living? This coot by the side of the lake. What characteristics of life is it showing at present? There's our beautiful family of swans. The parents are the cygnets. I'm not going to get very close. I got chased the other day, which was quite scary. I was almost ended up in the brambles trying to run away from it. But what characteristics of life do they show, this family of swans? They've been mowing round here to keep the paths clear. This is the remains of the mown grass. Does this belong to living, once living or non-living? Can you see the beetle in the grass? What category will you put that into? Would you put this seed in living, once living or non-living? That's a tricky one. This is a beautiful peacock butterfly. What group would you put this peacock butterfly into? Here's a small stream. What group would you put the water into? Living, once living, or none living? A piece of bark from the tree. What group would you put bark into? Living, once living, or none living? Can you hear the bird in the tree? There's also a horse next door. There's another bird up there. There's a horse again. Is a bird living, once living, or none living? There's the horse. What's that? Living, once living, or none living? What characteristics is it showing at present that show it's a living thing? As you can probably hear, I've left the quiet of the fields and returned to the roads. That's something I really do miss about lockdown, was the quiet roads. Now it just seems to have gone back to normal. But think about cars. They show many of the characteristics of living things, don't they? Have a think about those 8 characteristics and write down the characteristics you think that cars show and the characteristics that they don't show.
Let's go through the organisation of the items from the walk. The signpost was made of metal, so goes under none living. The grass that was behind me was living. It was still nice and green. The brick showed no characteristics of life, so that also goes into none living. The feather was grown by a bird, so is part of a living thing, but is no longer part of a living thing, so it comes under once living. The bees were obviously living as they were flying around. The foil, which had been dropped by somebody, has never been living, so that needs to go into none living. The tissue paper is made from trees, so that goes under once living. The bunch of flowers is an interesting one because they were obviously living when they were part of the plant, but as soon as they are picked, they start to die. These ones look like they were pretty much dead, so I would put them under once living. But if you put them under living, then that was okay. The thistle flowers were actually part of the plant and so were living. The wooden fence was made from wood, which was once a tree, so that is once living. The plastic sign goes under none living. The coot was moving around and was pretty obviously living. It showed other characteristics of life too. It was feeding and was obviously alert to its surroundings. The swans were also moving and come under living. They also show that they reproduce as there were cygnets with them and with the parent, and the cygnets are growing into adult swans. The grass clippings come under once living because they were living when they were part of the grass, but once they've been detached from the grass plant, they start to die, and these ones were obviously pretty much dead because they were brown. The beetle was moving around, scurrying around, looking for food, goes under living. The seed is another interesting one. The seed is dormant at the moment, but may well germinate into a new plant, so is regarded as living. The beautiful peacock butterfly was obviously living. It responded to movement around it, so it was sensitive to the surroundings and it was moving. The water was also moving, but it doesn't show the characteristics of life, and it is none living. The bark came off a tree, so it was once living. The birds singing in the trees, they were happy birds singing away, which was really nice to hear. The horse was swishing its tail and eating. It was living. So the characteristics a horse was showing was that it was feeding and it was moving.
I asked you to write down the characteristics of life that cars demonstrate and the ones that they do not. And I'd like you to keep this list until near the end of the lesson, after I've explained each characteristic in a little more detail. Now we've started looking at living things, you can see that there is huge variety amongst them, but they do all have the 8 characteristics of life. So let's go through each of these characteristics one by one and look at them in more detail. Movement is an action by an organism or part of an organism causing a change of position. To qualify as movement, it has to be without outside help, such as wind. In animals, movement is easier to see and involves many different forms, such as the obvious flying, the swimming like these ducks are doing, and walking. We are the only primates that move around exclusively on 2 legs. Bipedalism might feel natural to us, but in fact it's a specialised adaptation that is rather difficult compared to walking on all 4s. No wonder most apes and monkeys avoid it. It also explains why back pain is so common in humans. There are slightly more unusual methods of moving. Starfish move along the seafloor by using little limbs that protrude from their body. Movement takes place when the starfish pumps water into the limbs in turn, creating a wave-like motion. Squid and octopi move via jet propulsion, expelling water from inside their bodies. This way of moving, however, consumes a lot of energy. Some animals do not move, or move infrequently. Most sea anemones live attached to rocks, but use movement of their tentacles to catch passing food. They can, however, move, if necessary, by gliding on their base. Barnacles live cemented to hard rocks. Once they choose a spot to settle on, they're stuck there until they die, poor things. I've just talked about animals so far, but what about the other organisms? Plants move their leaves towards the light, and this is a growth movement called a tropism. Growth movement towards light is called phototropism. Roots grow towards gravity, and this is called geotropism. The mimosa leaves droop almost at once when they are touched or hit by a raindrop, like in Avatar when Jake touches the plants and they suck down into tubes, revealing that funny hammerhead animal. But back to biology. The Venus flytrap snaps shut when 2 of its sensitive hairs are touched at the same time. Before the flowers of the sunflower form and are pollinated, young sunflower plants face the sun at dawn and follow the sun's movement as it moves across the sky, due to an inner body clock or circadian rhythm. And at night this body clock reverses their movement after the sun goes down, and they once again face the eastern sky until the sun rises the following morning. This is believed to not only increase the absorbance of light by the leaves for photosynthesis, but also to help attract pollinating insects to the flowers. Movement is evolutionarily important for organisms because it improves the chance of catching food, finding a mate, finding water, and avoiding capture. Organisms that aren't able to move freely will usually have strong defences against predation or reproduce rapidly to replace the organisms killed. Respiration is the release of energy in the form of ATP from food substances, mainly glucose, in all living cells. Please do not say it is making energy, as energy cannot be made or destroyed. It can just be converted from one form to another. We are very active organisms, so need plenty of energy and therefore rely mainly on a type of respiration called aerobic respiration. This requires oxygen, which combines normally with glucose to release the metabolic waste carbon dioxide and water. The thing we need from this equation is the ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which can then be used by our cells to grow, for muscle contraction, to absorb certain substances, to make other molecules, and so on. Many organisms, including green plants, have a preference for aerobic respiration, as much more energy is released. However, if oxygen is in short supply, we can use anaerobic respiration for short periods to get out of danger, for example, like if you are being chased by a rabid dog. Some organisms respire anaerobically as a choice, such as the bacterium Clostridium tetani, which lives in the soil, and other areas such as the intestines in animals. Their spores can cause the disease tetanus if they get into open wounds, which is why if you cut yourself badly, the doctor asks whether you are up to date with your tetanus vaccinations. Some microorganisms, in areas where there is not very much oxygen, use other molecules such as nitrates and iron to help break down sugars.
Please note, respiration is a series of chemical reactions that go on inside cells to release energy. It is not the same as breathing. Breathing refers to the movements that enable air to enter and exit the lungs so oxygen can enter our body and we can get rid of the waste gas carbon dioxide. As I mentioned at the start, not all organisms can breathe as they do not have lungs, so breathing is not a characteristic of life, only respiration is. Sensitivity is the ability to detect and respond to changes in the environment, which are known as stimuli. All organisms are able to sense changes in their environment and will respond accordingly. As we've already mentioned, plants respond to light by turning their leaves towards it. They can also detect water and grow their roots towards it. Algae can swim towards light. Barnacles will close their shells during low tide to prevent themselves from drying out. Squid release ink when they feel threatened, and rabbits run away when they are startled by a noise. This response to change in the environment is essential for survival, to protect the organism from harm, to find food and to get water as a few examples. As you can see in these pictures, it's showing the shoot growing towards the light and away from gravity, so that is responding to changes. And the eye here in the left-hand side is in bright light and the pupil shrinks to protect the retina from damage. But when the eye is in dim light, the pupil has to widen to let more light in to see as clearly as possible. And these are controlled by special muscles in your iris. Homeostasis is the maintenance of a constant internal environment. All living things have an internal environment inside them and inside their cells. This internal environment needs to be maintained within certain conditions. Control refers to the way organisms are able to preserve the environment inside their cells and organs to a certain set of conditions, like levelling out a seesaw. If homeostasis is successful, life continues. If unsuccessful, death often ensues. In mammals, the nervous and endocrine systems control homeostasis through feedback mechanisms involving various organs and organ systems. For example, we sweat more when we are hot and shiver when cold. Dogs pant as a means of evaporative cooling. When a dog gets hot, it will open its mouth and breathe heavily. As water evaporates from the dog's tongue, nasal passages and lungs, this helps lower its body temperature. While dogs primarily use panting to cool themselves down, they also sweat, but only through their paws. They have sweat glands in their paws, but not enough to cool the dog down. It is thought that this sweating may actually have something to do with making the paws more sticky, so they have more grip. Plants need to regulate carbon dioxide intake for photosynthesis and also control water loss. If plants do not keep enough water in their cells, they will wilt and die. Stomata, which are tiny pores in the leaf, allow gases to enter and leave and water vapour to leave as well. Special cells, called guard cells, open and close the stomata, so during periods of limited water availability, the stomata can be shut. Reproduction is the process that makes more of the same kind of organism. In other words, the making of a new organism from an existing organism. The simplest form of reproduction is the division of one cell into two. Bacteria reproduce in this way, and it is called binary fission, binary meaning two and fission meaning split. For large multicellular organisms, reproduction is more complicated than a single division of a cell. Reproduction can occur sexually or asexually. Sexual reproduction requires two organisms. For example, these swans, there's a male and a female swan, and they have produced several cygnets. Asexual reproduction is where one organism produces a new organism entirely by themselves, and the organism is genetically identical to the original organism. In other words, a clone. So, a spider plant putting out a plantlet and making a new plant is a form of asexual reproduction. It is much faster than sexual reproduction, so it means the organism can take over new areas rapidly. In sexual reproduction, the genetic material from each parent is split in half and combined with the genetic material of the second parent. This creates a unique individual with a mix of genes from two parents, which is why most of us are a cross between our mother and father, both in looks and personality. Plants can also reproduce sexually. Flowers are the sex organ of a plant. Inside the flower are anthers, which produce the male sex cell or gamete, the pollen, and the eggs are found in the ovary of the plant below the style and stigma. Excretion is the removal of metabolic waste from the organism.
Metabolic waste means waste from chemical reactions that have occurred within the organism, such as carbon dioxide produced during aerobic respiration, which we then breathe out or excrete. If waste products stay inside an organism, they can become toxic. All organisms, therefore, have methods for removing these metabolic wastes. As well as lungs to breathe out carbon dioxide, we also excrete the waste from protein breakdown, urea. The kidneys filter the urea and other waste, such as from the breakdown of paracetamol you took for headache, out of the blood. Urine is formed, which is stored in the bladder and excreted out of the body via the urethra. We also sweat, which releases salt, water and some urea from the body, which is why unwashed sports kit sat in the changing rooms for a week smells so awful. In single-celled organisms, such as this amoeba, waste products are discharged directly through the surface of the cell, often by simple diffusion. Plants eliminate waste gases through the stomata on the surface of their leaves. Excretion should not be confused with digestion, which is the removal from the body of undigested food. This undigested food has not entered any of the cells and it has not been in any chemical reactions, so it is not a metabolic waste. Remember, excretion is wee-wee. Digestion is poo, or more scientifically described as faeces. Many people misuse the term excretion as a euphemism for digestion and use excrement as a term for faeces, but this is biologically incorrect. Nutrition is the taking in or making of food which can then be used by the organism. In order for organisms to survive, they require food for energy and to make other biological molecules. Energy and nutrients are essential for growth, survival and reproduction. Many living things, such as animals, acquire nutrients by eating other organisms. They are heterotrophs, hetero meaning different or other, and troph meaning nourishment. Other organisms, such as plants, make their own food from their environment. They are autotrophs, auto meaning oneself and troph again meaning nourishment. Plants use energy from the sun to convert carbon dioxide in the atmosphere into glucose, and their roots absorb water and minerals from the soil, so they can convert this glucose into other biological molecules or respire it to release energy. Growth is a permanent increase in size of an organism by an increase in size or number of cells. It requires energy and nutrients, in particular proteins. If organisms do not get enough of one particular nutrient, their growth can be inhibited. This is one of the main reasons it is believed that humans are, on average, so much taller now than they once were, because we have better nutrition. Over the last 150 years, the average height of people in industrialised nations has increased approximately 10 centimetres. Organisms grow at different rates. The fastest growing plant, upwards growth that is the bamboo. It is able to shoot up as tall as a 10-storey building in just 8 weeks. On the other hand, the saguaro cactus, the one you tend to see on cowboy films, which looks like upwards pointing forks, grows just 1 inch in the first 10 years of its life. The red kangaroo adult measures from the head to its rump between 1 and 1.6 metres. Its tail adds another 90 to 110 centimetres to its length, and its entire body weighs around 90 kilograms. But it only starts out at about 2 centimetres long, weighing less than a gram, about the size of a bee. So there we have it, the 8 characteristics of life, remembered as Mr. Schreng. Now let's cast our minds back to the car. When you thought about the car and compared it to the 8 characteristics of life remembered by Mr. Schreng, what characteristics do cars show that living things show? They definitely move, as that's the point of them, and they require energy to move that they get from burning fuel, but that is not respiration, as it does not occur in cells. They do respond to changes in the environment, such as temperature, and they do have mechanisms such as aircon to try to maintain a constant environment, but do rely on us to top up oil and put air into the tyres. They definitely do not reproduce. They do release waste from burning fuel out of the exhaust, so you could say that they excrete. And we have to fill them up with fuel, which you could liken to nutrition, but they do not grow. Now we've looked at cars, I want to mention viruses. These do not pass the 8 characteristics of life test, and so are not regarded as living. Viruses are not made out of cells. A virus is just genetic material bundled up inside a protein coat, sometimes surrounded by a fatty envelope. Viruses do not have nuclei, organelles or cytoplasm like cells do, and so they have no way to monitor or create change in their internal environment. In other words, they cannot carry out homeostasis. Viruses do definitely multiply or reproduce, but they have to use other cells that are not viruses to do so. They cannot reproduce by themselves or with other viruses. Viruses manipulate host cells into building new viruses, which means each virus is made in its fully formed state, and so it does not grow. Energy is needed to make new viruses in the host cell, but this energy comes from the respiration in the host cell, not from respiration in the virus. We don't know whether viruses respond to the environment, but seeming as it has failed to pass in many of the other areas, it cannot be regarded as a living organism. Hopefully now you are happy with the 8 characteristics of life and are ready to finish with an exam question. This is a past exam question from Edexcel IGCSE. All organisms share common basic characteristics. Some of these are given below with a simple description. Complete the table by adding the missing characteristics and the missing descriptions. There's 4 marks for this, so 1 mark for each of the boxes completed. I suggest you press pause and have a go at jotting down your answers and spend up to 4 minutes of this, and then I will go through it with you. Let's have a look at the answers to this exam question then. Nutrition, the taking in or making of, in this case of plants, food. Releasing energy in cells is respiration. Producing offspring is reproduction. Growth and development, the permanent, remember it's got to be permanent, increase in size of an organism. And you could say there by an increase in size or number of cells. It's got to be permanent because sometimes people get bigger because they might have put weight on, but then they might lose that weight again. And so that's not regarded as growth. All right. So those 4 answers will give you your 4 marks. Don't forget your buzzwords. You need to learn these for this part of the unit. Make sure you are happy to use them in your written answers as they are important to get the top marks.